The dawn light that crept across Jedediah Colton's weathered porch marked 3,652 mornings since he'd heard another human voice on his ranch, a silence he'd cultivated as carefully as his sparse Wyoming grassland. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, mending fence line that winter had tested. The '78 spring had come reluctantly, much like the man himself. 10 years alone had worn smooth the rough edges of grief, leaving behind a quiet competence that required no witness. When his hand found Emily's silver hairbrush buried in the toolbox, Jed's fingers stilled. Some ghosts couldn't be fenced out, some wounds never fully healed. The distant dust cloud rising from town suggested that today, unlike the thousands before it, would force him to speak. Jed tucked the brush into his pocket, unaware that by sunset he would face a choice between the safety of his solitude and the dangerous possibility of redemption. 10 years of silence and solitude versus the bruises on a widow's wrists and a child who needs protection. Jed faces the choice between safety and courage, between the past he can't change and a future he never imagined. What wounds from your past have shaped your choices? When have you risked comfort for what's right? Share your thoughts below, and follow this trail of redemption to discover how a lonely rancher, a traumatized widow, and an orphaned girl forge a family from courage, not blood. Because sometimes healing only begins when we open our doors to others, even when it hurts. The dawn light that crept across Jedediah Colton's weathered porch marked 3,652 mornings since he'd heard another human voice on his ranch, a silence he'd cultivated as carefully as his sparse Wyoming grassland. Jed worked the fence line with practiced efficiency, his calloused hands moving as if they remembered what his mind tried to forget. Spring of '78 had come reluctantly to the high country, frost still rimming the water trough each morning despite April's approach. The post he was setting would hold through summer storms and winter blizzards alike. He built things to last, even if nothing else in life did. His gelding nickered softly from where it was tethered nearby, steam rising from its nostrils in the cool morning air. Jed paused to run a hand along the animal's flank, the closest thing to companionship he permitted himself these days. "Easy, Shadow," he murmured, the sound of his own voice unfamiliar in the vastness. 10 years had worn his speech down to the essential, like water smoothing stone. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold, but Jed drank it anyway. Waste was a luxury a man living on the edge of civilization couldn't afford. He'd learned that lesson during his first winter alone, when grief had made him careless and nearly cost him everything. His routine rarely varied. Fence work at dawn, cattle tended by mid-morning, repairs to the modest cabin when weather permitted. The rhythm of it kept him moving forward when memory threatened to drag him back. It was only when he reached into his toolbox for the hammer and his fingers closed around Emily's silver hairbrush that the rhythm faltered. Some ghosts couldn't be fenced out, no matter how carefully a man built his barriers. Jed stood in the doorway of his cabin, studying the dust cloud rising from the direction of town. Twice yearly, he made the half-day ride for supplies he couldn't produce himself: ammunition, coffee, salt. His last trip had been barely a month ago. The approaching riders weren't expected, and in Jed's experience, the unexpected rarely brought anything good. He slipped Emily's hairbrush into his pocket, a talisman against whatever was coming. With deliberate movements, he checked his revolver, tucked it into his holster, and saddled Shadow. Town visits ranked just above amputation on his list of preferred activities, but something about that dust cloud suggested he didn't have a choice. Sheridan wasn't much as towns went. A single street of false-fronted buildings serving the scattered ranches and homesteads that had sprouted across the territory since the war. As Jed rode in, he noted the usual activity: freight wagons being loaded, a cowhand sleeping off last night's whiskey on the boardwalk, Harriet Simmons sweeping the porch of her general store. "Twice in 1 month, Jedediah Colton," Harriet called, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Town's getting downright crowded with your visits." Jed touched his hat brim. "Just passing through, Harriet." "New cook at the boarding house makes a fine midday meal," she said, leaning on her broom. "Wouldn't hurt you to eat something not cooked by your own hand for once." His stomach chose that moment to remind him he'd forgotten breakfast. With a non-committal grunt that Harriet chose to interpret as agreement, Jed tied Shadow to the hitching post outside the boarding house. It was there, in the dim interior smelling of fresh bread and coffee, that he first saw Clara May Dawson, and the bruises darkening her wrists like shadows that couldn't be outrun. The woman's eyes had met his for only a moment as she set down his plate, but in that fleeting contact, Jed had recognized something familiar: the wariness of someone carrying wounds deeper than the visible marks on her skin. When she'd pulled her sleeve down to cover the bruises, her movements had been practiced, automatic. None of your concern, he'd told himself, focusing on the stew that was indeed better than anything he'd cooked in years. People carried their own troubles in this country. A man who started asking questions rarely liked the answers he got. But now, riding back toward his ranch with the afternoon sun at his back, the wagon tracks cutting across his land told a different story. Fresh tracks, deep set from a heavy load, heading toward Willow Creek, the same direction where the widow Dawson had taken a small cabin after being hired at the boarding house. Jed dismounted, studying the sign with the eye of a man who'd learned to read the land like others read books. 2 horses pulling a wagon, a third horse alongside, riders who knew where they were going. No attempt to hide their passage, men with nothing to hide, or men who didn't fear being followed. He stood, dusting his hands on his pants, considering his options. The sensible choice was clear: return to his ranch, mind his fences, keep to the silence he'd built around himself like armor. Instead, he found himself turning Shadow toward a different trail, one he hadn't ridden in years. If anyone would know what trouble might be brewing, it would be Marshal Thomas Blackwood. The old ranger's cabin came into view just as dusk was settling. Through the window, Jed could see lamplight, and the silhouette of Blackwood cleaning his guns with methodical precision. "Been expecting trouble too, have you?" Blackwood asked, when Jed's shadow darkened his door. "Trouble has a name," Jed replied, "and it's headed this way." Blackwood's cabin was a study in efficient order, every item placed with purpose, much like the man himself. At 60, the former Texas Ranger moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned which movements might cost him his life. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "Silas Boone," Blackwood said, setting a steaming cup before Jed. "Former Confederate captain, turned bounty hunter, turned something worse." Jed wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. "Never heard of him." "You wouldn't have. Moves from territory to territory. Never stays long enough to build a reputation in one place." Blackwood pulled a folded paper from a stack on his table. "Acquires women and children through threats or false papers. Sells some, keeps others." "And the law?" Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "He stays just legal enough. Territorial judge is 3 weeks' ride. Sheriff Parker's stretched thin across the county." Jed studied the paper. A crude, wanted poster from Colorado Territory, 2 years old. The face staring back held the cold calculation of a man who viewed people as commodities. "The Dawson woman at the boarding house," Jed said finally. "I saw bruises on her wrists and wagon tracks cutting across my land toward Willow Creek." Blackwood nodded. "Clara May, Showed up 3 months back. Girl with her too, silent little thing called Annie. Been watching them. Something in how they move, always looking over their shoulders. Not my concern, Jed said, the words hollow even to his own ears. Wasn't asking you to make it your concern. Blackwood's eyes, still sharp as a hawk's, met his. But we'll need Eli Freeman if this turns ugly. The blacksmith, don't know him. Buffalo soldier, 10th Cavalry. Best shot I've seen since you put away your rifle. The boarding house kitchen after hours was warm and redolent with the day's cooking, a stark contrast to the palpable tension in Clara Mae Dawson's shoulders when she turned to find Jed standing in the doorway. "Mr. Colton," she said, her voice carefully neutral as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Kitchen's closed till morning. Not here for food, ma'am." Jed remained by the door, giving her space. "Hear about the wagon tracks heading toward your place." Her hands stilled, and in the silence that followed, a small sound from the corner drew Jed's attention. A girl of perhaps 7 years sat on a low stool, clutching a simple cloth doll, watching him with eyes too old for her face. "Annie," Clara said softly, "go upstairs now." The child didn't move, her gaze fixed on Jed with the wariness of a wild thing. "She stays with me," Clara said, answering the question Jed hadn't asked. She straightened her spine, one hand unconsciously touching her wrist where the bruises Jed had noticed earlier marked her skin. "What business is it of yours, where wagons travel?" "Might be none," Jed conceded. "Might be trouble heading your way." Something flickered in Clara's eyes, fear, quickly masked. "I was his cook," she said after a long moment. "That's what he called it. More his property than his employee." "And the girl?" "Annie was there when he acquired me. Previous cook's daughter, I reckon. She had no one else." "So you took her and ran?" Clara's chin lifted slightly. "Wouldn't you?" She gestured to Annie, who reluctantly approached and extended her arm. A small, round scar marked the inside of her wrist. "He says she belongs to him, but what he did to her folks says otherwise." The blacksmith shop hummed with the rhythm of hammer on metal, sparks dancing in the dimness as Eli Freeman shaped a horseshoe with practiced precision. At Blackwood's introduction, the man nodded without breaking his rhythm, finishing his stroke before plunging the metal into water with a satisfying hiss. "Heard about you," Eli said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "The rancher who doesn't come to town." "Yet here I am," Jed replied. Eli studied him with intelligent eyes. "Must be important." Blackwood explained the situation while Eli listened, asking occasional sharp questions that revealed a tactical mind beneath his craftsman's exterior. When the former ranger finished, Eli set down his tools with deliberate care. "I'll help," he said simply. "Need till morning to arrange things here." As they stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, a burly man deliberately shouldered past Jed, forcing him to step aside. "You Colton?" the stranger asked, alcohol heavy on his breath, but eyes cold sober. "Boss says you been asking questions that ain't your business. Your boss got a name?" Jed kept his voice level, aware of Blackwood shifting position beside him. "Mr. Boone says to mind your own affairs, especially regarding his property." The man's hand drifted toward his belt. "Women and children aren't property in Wyoming territory," Jed said. The flash of a knife came with surprising speed for a man of his size. Jed twisted away, the blade slicing air where he'd stood. Before the attacker could recover, Blackwood's pistol butt struck him precisely behind the ear, dropping him to the dirt like a felled tree. Sheriff Parker arrived moments later, too late as usual, reluctant to take action against a man just having too much to drink. Across the street, Eli Freeman watched from his doorway, his decision visibly hardening in his eyes. Dawn painted long shadows across Jed's ranch as three men walked its perimeter, each viewing the land through different eyes. Blackwood studied approaches and sight lines with a lawman's tactical precision. Eli assessed natural cover with a soldier's calculation of defensible positions. Jed simply saw his home, now transformed into a potential battleground. "North approach is too exposed," Blackwood said, gesturing toward the open grassland stretching toward distant hills. "They'd be fools to come that way." "Unless they want us to think that," Eli countered, dark eyes scanning the horizon. "Set up expecting them from the creek, they might just risk the open ground." Jed nodded toward the cabin. "Water supplies protected, food for a week, ammunition for longer." "Colton, you built this place expecting trouble," Blackwood observed. "Wasn't expecting it," Jed replied, adjusting his hat against the rising sun. "Just never discount it." Inside, Clara moved with quiet efficiency, taking inventory of supplies while keeping Annie occupied with simple tasks. The girl hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived the previous evening, but her watchful eyes missed nothing. Eli had brought his gunsmith's tools along with his blacksmith's strength, and he worked now at the rough-hewn table, checking each weapon with methodical care. "Rifle sights off," he noted, making a minute adjustment to Jed's Winchester. "Man aims true as you, should have noticed. Been a while since I shot anything but game," Jed admitted. "Like riding," Blackwood said, loading cartridges into his Colt. "Body remembers even when the mind tries to forget." Their preparations continued through the morning, windows reinforced, firing positions established, escape routes planned. They worked with minimal talk, each man's expertise complementing the other's. It was Annie who saw it first, her small hand tugging at Clara's skirt, pointing silently toward the horizon where a dust cloud rose against the blue Wyoming sky. Three riders approached at an unhurried pace, confidence in every line of their posture. The man in the center sat his horse with military bearing, his black coat and hat a stark contrast to the dust of the trail. Even at a distance, his authority was palpable. "That'll be Silas Boone," Blackwood murmured from his position by the cabin door. Jed stood in the yard, seemingly relaxed, though his hand rested near his holster. Behind him, Eli had positioned himself on the porch, rifle held casually but ready. Clara and Annie remained inside, though Jed knew Clara watched through the window, the shotgun Blackwood had given her within reach. The riders halted at the edge of the yard, just beyond comfortable shooting distance. The central figure surveyed the ranch with the calculating gaze of a man assessing property values. "Mr. Colton," he called, his voice cultured, almost pleasant. "I understand you've been harboring individuals legally in my employ." "Don't see any employees here," Jed replied evenly. "Just free citizens of the territory." Silas Boone smiled without warmth. "Mrs. Dawson signed a contract of service. The child is legally under my guardianship following her parents' unfortunate accident." "Papers can be forged," Jed said. "Contracts signed under duress don't stand." "I have the law on my side, Mr. de Colton." Boone's eyes flicked to Blackwood, then to Eli. "Do you have anything beyond that rifle and an aging ranger?" "Got enough." Boone's gaze shifted to the cabin window, where Annie's face was briefly visible. Something cold flickered in his eyes. "That child is valuable to me, Mr. Colton, more than you might realize. I'll return tomorrow to collect what's mine. I suggest you reconsider your position before then." As they turned to ride away, Jed noticed how Boone's eyes had methodically catalogued every detail of the ranch's defenses. Silence hung heavy in the cabin after the riders departed. Clara stood by the window, one hand pressed against the rough-hewn logs as if to steady herself. Annie remained motionless beside her, small fingers clutching her doll. "He'll be back," Blackwood said, unnecessarily, checking his pistol with practiced movements. "And with more men." Jed nodded, his attention on Clara's pale face. "You all right?" "I will be," she answered, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. "It's just seeing him again." Annie's voice, when it came, startled them all, high and clear in the stillness. "He shot Papa, when Papa said I wasn't for sale." Clara knelt immediately, gathering the child close. "You don't have to talk about it, sweetheart." But Annie's words continued, tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "Mama tried to run with me. He caught us at the creek." Her small fingers touched the burn scar on her arm. "Said it was so, I'd remember to be good." Jed crouched down to meet the child's eyes at her level. "No one's taking you anywhere, Annie. You have my word on that." "Territory Court would hang him on her testimony," Blackwood said quietly to Jed as they moved toward the door. "If she lives to give it," Jed replied, his voice equally low. Outside, they found Eli securing the horses in the barn. The former Buffalo soldier worked methodically, his movements efficient despite the gravity in his expression. "Girl's a witness," Jed told him. Eli nodded once, understanding the implications immediately. "Changes things. Man like Boone can't afford to leave her alive now." "You can still ride out," Jed offered. "This wasn't your fight to begin with." "Some fights choose you," Eli replied, his eyes on the distant horizon where Boone had disappeared. "Some fights you can't walk away from and still call yourself a man." Evening settled over the ranch, bringing momentary peace. On the porch, the men cleaned weapons and checked ammunition by lamplight, the rhythm of their work punctuated by occasional words. Inside, Clara had finally convinced Annie to sleep, the child's exhaustion overcoming her fear. "10th Cavalry taught me two things," Eli said, oiling the action of his Spencer carbine with practiced hands. "How to shoot straight, and how people look at you don't determine your worth." Jed glanced up from loading cartridges. "Territory's different from military." "Not so different. Both places, what matters is who stands beside you when trouble comes." Eli sighted along his rifle barrel, making a minute adjustment. "Colonel said a man's mettle shows clearest when the odds turn against him." Blackwood nodded, passing a cup of coffee to Eli. "Rode with colored troops in '65, finest soldiers I ever saw." "Your colonel was right," Jed said after a moment. "Seen men I thought steady break when the shooting started. Seen others I never noticed stand tall when needed." Eli's hands continued their work, steady and sure. "Sergeant said justice is like this sight. You adjust it carefully, or you miss what you're aiming for." Clara appeared in the doorway, weariness evident in the set of her shoulders. "Annie's finally asleep," she said, accepting the cup of coffee Jed offered. "She hasn't spoken that much since—" Her voice trailed off. "Since Silas," Jed finished for her. She nodded, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight. "What happens tomorrow?" "He comes back with more men," Blackwood said matter-of-factly. "We show him why that was a poor decision." As if in answer, a flicker of movement caught their attention at the ridgeline. A lone rider silhouetted against the stars, watching. Within moments, he was joined by others, their shapes forming a dark necklace along the horizon. "They're not waiting till tomorrow," Eli observed quietly. Pre-dawn light seeped through the cabin windows, casting gray shadows across tense faces. Outside, the watchers on the ridge had multiplied during the night. At least a dozen men now, their patience a more effective threat than any display of aggression. Clara checked the shotgun with unexpected familiarity, breaking it open to load shells with practiced movements. When she caught Jed's questioning glance, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My father had no sons," she explained, snapping the weapon closed. "Taught me to shoot before I could read." "Why didn't you use that skill on Silas?" Jed asked quietly. "And leave Annie alone if I failed?" She shook her head. "Survival sometimes means waiting for the right moment." Across the room, Annie arranged bandages and water as Clara had shown her, small hands working with solemn concentration. The child's revelation yesterday had changed something in her, as if speaking the truth had unlocked some reserve of strength. "I can help too," she said, meeting Jed's eyes directly for the first time. Blackwood returned from checking the perimeter, frost rimming his coat in the early morning chill. "They're spreading out, covering all approaches. Eli's in position at the barn." Jed nodded, mentally reviewing their preparations. The old ranger had positioned everyone with tactical precision, Clara and Annie in the root cellar if shooting started, himself covering the south approach from the barn loft, Blackwood at the north corner of the cabin, and Jed watching the main approach. "He'll test us first," Blackwood predicted, checking his ammunition one final time. "See if we scare easy." "And when we don't?" Clara asked. Jed met her eyes across the room. "Then we show him why he should." The crack of a rifle shot split the morning stillness, the bullet splintering wood beside the window. Silas Boone's opening argument. The first volley came from multiple directions, rifle fire peppering the cabin and outbuildings, more meant to pin them down than to find targets. Jed held his position by the window, counting shots, identifying locations by sound and flash. "West approach. 3 men," Blackwood called from his corner. Jed sighted carefully on movement behind a distant boulder. "I see them." His Winchester cracked, and a cry confirmed his aim remained true despite the years. From the barn loft, Eli's Spencer carbine spoke with methodical precision. "Rider circling east," he reported between shots. "Trying to flank." Clara had moved Annie to the root cellar as planned, but returned to load spare weapons, her face calm, despite the bullets thudding into the cabin walls. "How many are there?" "Too many to count," Jed answered truthfully. "Not enough to matter." A bullet shattered the window glass, sending shards across the floor. Clara flinched, but continued her work, murmuring quiet instructions to Annie, who was counting to 50 before handing up loaded guns as they'd practiced. Outside, one of Boone's men made a dash toward the water trough, seeking better cover. Blackwood's shot dropped him halfway there. Another tried for the barn, but encountered Eli's unerring aim. The intensity of fire increased, concentrated now on the cabin's most vulnerable points. Jed moved from window to window, shooting sparingly but effectively, forcing Boone's men to keep their heads down. "They're pulling back," Blackwood announced, after nearly 30 minutes of exchange. Jed watched as several riders retreated beyond effective rifle range, regrouping around a tall figure on a black horse. Even at this distance, Silas Boone's posture communicated not defeat, but calculation. "This was just to test our strength," Jed said, a cold certainty settling in his gut. "He's coming back, and next time he won't hold anything back." Midday sun beat down on the ranch, the stillness after battle more unsettling than the chaos of gunfire. Jed tended to Eli's arm where a bullet had grazed the muscle, the wound painful but not serious. Clara moved through the cabin, gathering scattered glass and assessing damage, while Annie followed close behind, unwilling to let her protector out of sight. 4 men down by my count, Blackwood said, returning from a cautious reconnaissance of the perimeter. Rest pulled back with Boone. He's not done, Jed replied, finishing the bandage on Eli's arm. Clara paused in her work, dust and plaster powder whitening her dark hair. Will he come back today? No. Blackwood's expression was grim. He'll regroup, bring more men. Eli flexed his bandaged arm carefully. We held this time. Next time won't be so easy. Jed moved to the doorway, surveying the deceptively peaceful landscape. The morning's battle had been almost predictable, a show of force meant to intimidate, to test their resolve and defenses. That they'd repelled it with minimal injury spoke to their preparation, but also to Boone's restraint. A dangerous man showing restraint was more concerning than a dangerous man showing rage. We need to get word to town, Jed said. Sheriff Parker can't ignore gunfire this close to his jurisdiction. Unless Boone got to him first, Eli suggested quietly. Clara joined Jed at the door, her shoulder nearly touching his. We drove them off once. We can do it again. The confidence in her voice almost made Jed believe it, almost. But his eyes were fixed on the distant ridge where 2 riders remained, watching the ranch, sentinels ensuring they stayed put while Boone made his next move. The false victory of the morning would cost them dearly by nightfall. Jed could feel it as surely as the coming storm. They came with the afternoon shadows, not in a charge, but in a methodical encirclement, riders positioning themselves beyond rifle range on every side of the ranch. Jed counted from the roof where he'd climbed for a better view, his expression darkening with each new figure that appeared on the horizon. 15, maybe 20, he reported as he rejoined the others. And those are just the ones showing themselves. Blackwood nodded grimly. Siege tactics. He means to starve us out. Or wait until our ammunition runs low, Eli added, conserving his wounded arm's strength for what would come. Clara stood at the window, Annie pressed against her side, watching the methodical positioning of their enemies. They're circling, like wolves. The comparison was apt. Wolves would isolate a prey animal, cut it off from the herd, and wait for weakness or desperation to force a mistake. Patience was often more effective than a direct attack. We need to get a message out, Jed said, mind working through diminishing options, before they close the circle completely. Eli studied the deployment of riders through his field glass. Too late for that. And look there! Clara's sharp intake of breath drew Jed's attention to what she'd spotted, riders moving into position on the road that led to town, blocking their last potential route for help or escape. We're trapped, she said quietly, her arm tightening protectively around Annie. And no one knows we need help. Twilight descended, bringing with it the smell of rain. Storm clouds gathered to the west, nature indifferent to the human conflict playing out beneath its gaze. As darkness fell, pinpricks of light appeared around the ranch's perimeter, campfires of men settling in for a long wait. Jed met Blackwood's eyes across the room, a silent communication passing between them. When all paths to safety are blocked, sometimes the only way out is through. Dawn of the second day brought no relief, only confirmation of their predicament. Rain had fallen intermittently through the night, turning the yard to mud and soaking the men maintaining their vigil around the ranch. Yet the watchers remained, their campfires hissing in the dampness, but never extinguishing. Jed surveyed their situation with growing concern. The water barrel outside had been shot through during yesterday's exchange, the liquid seeping into the thirsty ground. Inside, supplies remained adequate but not abundant, enough for days, not weeks. "They're shooting at the rain barrels," Eli observed from his position near the window, where he'd been watching the occasional lazy shots directed at their water collection system. "Contaminating what we might gather." "Classic siege tactic," Blackwood confirmed, his lined face betraying fatigue despite his resolute posture. "Make us thirsty, make us desperate." Jed nodded. "We can collect rainwater from the roof if we're careful." Clara moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, rationing food and tending to Eli's wound, which had grown inflamed during the night. Annie followed in her shadow, carrying bandages and helping where her small hands could be useful. The child's silence had returned, but her eyes remained alert, watchful. "Annie, stay away from the windows," Clara cautioned as the girl drifted toward the light. The warning came a moment too late. A shot cracked across the yard, the bullet splintering the window frame and sending glass shards flying. Clara lunged forward, pushing Annie to the floor as fragments tore across her forearm, leaving a trail of crimson against her pale skin. "Clara?" Annie's cry broke the stunned silence as Jed rushed to their side. Blood soaked through Clara's sleeve, her face white with shock, but her first words were for the child. "Are you hurt? Annie, are you hit?" The siege had drawn its first blood, and the day had barely begun. Twilight settled over the ranch, bringing momentary respite from the random shots that had harassed them throughout the day. Clara's arm had been bandaged, the cuts from the glass painful but not life-threatening. More concerning was the message the attack had sent. Nowhere was truly safe, and Boone's patience had its limits. Jed stood by the window, watching Annie sleep fitfully on a pallet near the fireplace. Clara sat beside her, her injured arm cradled against her body, exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. The sight stirred something long dormant in Jed's chest, a protectiveness he'd thought buried with Emily. "I could ride out," he said quietly, the words meant for himself as much as for Clara. "Draw them away. Give you all a chance." Clara looked up, her eyes finding his in the dimness. "And let Annie watch another good man die, another person sacrificing themselves for her." Jed moved closer, lowering himself to the floor beside her. "I couldn't save my wife." "Don't want that happening again." "Emily's death wasn't your choice," Clara said softly, her uninjured hand finding his in the shadows. "This would be... we stand together." The warmth of her fingers against his sent an unexpected surge of emotion through Jed's chest. 10 years of isolation had not prepared him for the simple human connection of a hand seeking strength from his own. "Boone won't stop," he said after a moment. "He can't afford to with what Annie knows." "Then we find a way through." Clara's voice held a determination that belied her exhausted appearance. "You've survived this long because you didn't give up, Jedediah Colton. Don't start now." Outside, the rain began again, drumming on the roof in counterpoint to the distant thunder. Whether it was nature's storm or gunfire beyond the ridge, neither of them could tell. The sound came just before midnight, a soft scraping from the direction of the root cellar that had Jed and Eli instantly alert, weapons raised toward the trapdoor in the cabin floor. Blackwood had gone to check the barn hours earlier and not returned, a fact that had added to their growing concern. The trapdoor lifted slowly, and a familiar voice hissed from the darkness, "Hold your fire, it's Blackwood." The old ranger emerged from the cellar passage, soaked to the skin and covered in mud, but with a triumphant gleam in his eye. He dropped a waterproof pouch on the table and accepted the whiskey Jed offered without hesitation. "Storm's getting worse," he announced after a fortifying swallow. "Works in our favor." "Town?" Jed asked, hope flickering for the first time in days. Blackwood's expression soured. "Sheriff's sitting tight. Silas has friends in territorial government, it seems." "So we're on our own," Eli concluded, his wounded arm now held in a sling Clara had fashioned. "Not entirely." Blackwood opened the pouch, extracting a folded paper that he handled with unusual care. "I've got a plan, and something else." He spread the paper on the table, a faded photograph that brought Clara to her feet, Annie stirring behind her at the sudden movement. "That girl isn't who Silas claims she is," Blackwood said, his finger tapping the image of a family group. Father, mother, and a small girl whose features, though younger, unmistakably matched Annie's. "Her name isn't Annie. It's May Rose Denton. Her father was a circuit judge in Colorado Territory until Silas Boone had him killed 2 years ago." Clara's hand went to her mouth. Judge Denton, the man who was going to try Silas for land fraud. Blackwood nodded grimly. "May here is the only living witness who can connect Silas to 3 murders. That's why he wants her back so badly." "And why we can't let that happen," Jed finished, a new resolve hardening his voice. Rain hammered against the cabin roof as they gathered around the table, the photograph of Judge Denton's family illuminated by lamplight. Annie, or May, as they now knew her, slept fitfully nearby, unaware that her true identity had been discovered. "The root cellar tunnel," Blackwood explained, tracing a rough map drawn on the back of a wanted poster. "Built by the homesteader before you, Colton, runs 50 yards to a drainage ditch by the creek. Silas has men watching all obvious approaches, but they've missed this one." "How'd you find it?" Jed asked, studying the crude diagram. "Saw similar setups during the war, looked for the signs." The old ranger's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Used it to get out last night. Can use it to get help in." Eli leaned forward, his wounded arm cradled against his chest. "Someone needs to reach town, convince people to help. Sheriff won't move, but others might." "It's a one-man job," Jed said, his gaze moving between them. Through mud, in darkness, past Boone's men, Clara's hand found Jed's arm. "You're needed here." She turned to Eli. "Your arm." "We'll manage," Eli finished firmly. "I move quiet, and I've navigated hostile territory before. Buffalo soldiers didn't always get the warmest welcome." A moment of silence fell as they considered the risks. Finally, Jed nodded. "Harriet Simmons at the general store. Start with her. If anyone can rally the town, she can." "And if she can't?" Clara asked quietly. "Then we fight with what we have," Blackwood answered. Eli gathered minimal supplies, water, jerky, Jed's spare revolver. As he prepared to descend into the tunnel, he paused, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Dawn," he said simply. "Be ready." The trapdoor closed behind him, leaving only the sound of rain and distant thunder as they waited, measuring the night in heartbeats and the hope carried by one man through the darkness. Harriet Simmons had run Sheridan's general store for 15 years, outlasting 3 husbands and countless cowboy troublemakers. When Eli Freeman appeared at her back door before dawn, mud-caked and grim-faced, she listened without interruption to his account of the siege at Colton's ranch. By noon, her store had become a command center of sorts, with a dozen townspeople gathered, despite the continuing rain. Sheriff Parker stood uncomfortably near the door, his expression caught between professional caution and personal shame. "Territorial jurisdiction," he repeated, though with less conviction than an hour earlier. "Without clear evidence—" "A woman and child in danger isn't evidence enough," Harriet demanded, her thin frame vibrating with indignation. Gunfire at Colton's place isn't evidence enough? Blackwood's word that the girl is Judge Denton's daughter. Tom Blackwood's word is worth more than yours and mine combined, William Parker, and you know it. Harriet turned to address the gathered citizens. This isn't just about Colton and the widow. It's about what kind of town we're building here. One where men like Silas Boone can threaten our neighbors, or one where we stand together. Eli watched the shifting expressions, noting who nodded and who looked away. Among the resolute faces was the blacksmith who'd been minding his shop, a wiry man with capable hands who'd immediately offered ammunition from his own supplies. Most surprising was Jake Mitchell, son of the largest cattle baron in the county. "My father's men are yours," he said, stepping forward. 20 riders, well armed. Sheriff Parker's resolve finally crumbled under the weight of community opinion. "I'll deputize those willing," he conceded. "But if this goes wrong—" "It's already gone wrong," Harriet interrupted. "Now we make it right." As plans formed and weapons were distributed, Eli caught Mitchell's eye. "Why help?" he asked quietly. The cattleman's son smiled grimly. "Boone tried to buy my father's water rights last month, with forged papers." The storm intensified as night fell, lightning illuminating the besieged ranch in stark flashes of brilliance. Jed moved from window to window, watching for any sign of movement from Boone's men or return messengers from town. The constant downpour had turned the yard to a quagmire, providing cover for movement but making travel treacherous. "Should have heard something by now," Blackwood muttered, checking his timepiece for the 3rd time in an hour. Clara looked up from where she was brewing coffee on the stove, her bandaged arm moving stiffly. "Eli will make it." "Weather might have slowed him down, but he'll make it." Jed nodded, appreciating her steady confidence despite their circumstances. "May should eat something," he said, nodding toward the small alcove where they'd made a bed for the child. "Storm's keeping her awake." Clara moved to the alcove, then froze. "Jed!" she called, voice tight with sudden fear. "She's gone!" The words hit like physical blows. Jed crossed the room in 3 strides, confirming with his own eyes the empty blankets where the girl had been resting not 30 minutes earlier. May's doll remained, but the child herself had vanished. "Trapdoors still secured," Blackwood reported, checking the root cellar entrance. "And she couldn't have gone through the windows without us seeing." Jed's mind raced, cataloging possibilities. "The back door—" When the lightning knocked that branch down, we were all watching the yard. A quick search of the cabin's perimeter in the driving rain revealed small footprints leading away from the back door, quickly filling with water, but still discernible to Jed's experienced eye. Deeper impressions alongside showed a man's boots, not following, but leading. "One of Boone's men got close enough during the storm," Jed said, rain streaming down his face as he rejoined the others. "May's gone, and morning's still hours away." Clara's face hardened with determination, despite the fear in her eyes. "Then we don't wait for morning." The storm had become their ally, darkness and driving rain cloaking their movements as Jed and Blackwood slipped from the cabin through the root cellar tunnel. Clara had remained behind, not by choice, but by necessity. Someone needed to be there if May somehow found her way back, and her injured arm made her the logical choice, despite her fierce protests. "She headed east," Jed murmured, barely audible above the storm as they emerged from the drainage ditch, toward the ridge where we spotted most of Boone's men. Blackwood nodded, rain streaming from his hat brim. "He'll have taken her to his main camp. Wouldn't risk moving far in this weather." They moved like shadows through the muddy darkness, years of experience guiding their steps where eyes could not. Twice they froze, as sentries passed nearby, Men hunched miserably against the elements, more concerned with their own discomfort than watching for movement from the cabin they believed securely contained their quarry. The lightning revealed glimpses of the land ahead, enough to navigate by, enough to see the encampment nestled against the eastern ridge, canvas tents illuminated from within by lantern light. Jed counted a dozen, maybe 15 men, far fewer than he'd expected. "Rest must be watching other approaches," Blackwood whispered, following Jed's gaze. "Or headed off Eli's return from town." A sound from the north drew their attention, faint but unmistakable gunfire, quickly swallowed by thunder. Jed and Blackwood exchanged glances. Either Eli had encountered trouble, or help was already on its way. Distraction works in our favor, Jed decided, checking his weapons one final time. "I'll circle around to the south. You take the north. Find May first, everything else second." Blackwood's hand gripped his arm briefly. "Watch yourself." "Boone's no fool." "Neither are we," Jed replied, then melted into the storm as another flash of lightning split the sky. The largest tent stood slightly apart from the others, a single guard huddled miserably beneath an inadequate overhang. Jed approached from behind, rain masking his footsteps, until his arm locked around the man's throat, cutting off any warning cry. Within moments, the guard lay unconscious, bound with his own belt. Inside, lamplight cast harsh shadows across canvas walls. Silas Boone stood with his back to the entrance, studying a map spread across a camp table. Beside him, May sat on a crate, her small face set in silent defiance, despite the fear evident in her rigid posture. "Step away from her," Jed said quietly, his revolver aimed steadily at Boone's back. The man stiffened, but didn't turn. "Mr. Colton, I wondered who would come first." His voice remained cultured, controlled, even with death at his back. "The woman, perhaps, or the old ranger. But it's you, the man who says so little, yet acts so decisively." "Just step away," Jed repeated. Boone turned then, his movements deliberate, careful. "You know who she is now, I assume, what she represents." "May Rose Denton," Jed confirmed. "Daughter of the judge you murdered." A thin smile touched Boone's lips. "Alleged to have murdered. Without this child's testimony, there is no case." A fact the territorial governor, a personal friend, understands quite well. May's eyes found Jed's, hope warring with terror in her gaze. "It's over, Boone," Jed said, gesturing with his revolver for May to come to him. "The town's been alerted. Your men are scattered. That gunfire you hear is the cavalry arriving, so to speak." "Perhaps," Boone acknowledged, his hand drifting casually toward his coat. "But one bullet solves my most pressing problem, wouldn't you say?" The movement was quick, practiced, but Jed's response was quicker. His shot caught Boone's shoulder, spinning the man backward as May dove beneath the table. "That was for the judge," Jed said, advancing as Boone clutched his bleeding shoulder. "The next one's for Clara." Dawn broke across the rain-washed landscape, sunlight gleaming on puddles and wet grass as if the night's violence had never been. Outside the cabin, a curious assembly had gathered. Sheriff Parker and his hastily deputized townspeople, Jake Mitchell with his father's ranch hands, and Harriet Simmons dispensing coffee and bandages with equal efficiency. Silas Boone sat bound and sullen in a wagon bound for the territorial court, his remaining men either captured or fled into the hills. The photograph of Judge Denton's family had been verified by multiple witnesses who recognized the respected jurist and his family, confirming May's identity beyond doubt. Inside the cabin, Clara knelt before May, gently brushing the girl's tangled hair. "You were so brave," she murmured, her bandaged arm testament to her own courage. So very brave. The child leaned into Clara's touch, the silence of previous days replaced by occasional words, as if she were gradually remembering how to use her voice after so long. "Are we safe now?" she asked simply. "Yes," Clara answered, catching Jed's eye across the room. "We're safe." Blackwood entered, removing his hat with uncharacteristic formality. "Territorial Marshal's been telegraphed. He'll meet the prisoners at Fort Laramie." His weathered face creased in a rare smile. "Judge Harmon's with him, friend of May's father. Says he'll handle her guardianship personally." A shadow crossed Clara's face, quickly masked, but not before Jed noticed. He crossed to where they sat, lowering himself to one knee beside them. "Unless," he said carefully, "there's another arrangement that might suit better." Clara looked up, hope and uncertainty mingling in her expression. "What arrangement?" "This ranch has been mighty quiet for 10 years, Jed said, his voice rough with unaccustomed emotion. "Seems to me it could use a family." "Are you asking us to stay, Mr. Colton?" Clara's voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly where it rested on May's shoulder. "I'm asking for more than that, Mrs. Dawson." Jed took her hand in his, weathered fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm asking if you both might consider making this your home, permanent-like." May looked between them, understanding dawning in her young eyes. "Like a real family?" "Exactly like that," Jed confirmed, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. "I think," Clara said softly, a smile breaking across her features like sunrise after storm, "that might be the finest arrangement I've ever heard." 1 year later, the photograph of Judge Denton's family sat on the mantel of Jed and Clara Colton's ranch house, beside a newer image of 3 people whose bonds, forged in fire and sealed with love, had proven stronger than blood. "Well, partner, we've ridden a long trail together across the Wyoming Territory of 1878, through dust and gunfire, hope and heartache. If you're feeling a bit worn from the journey, Jed's isolation, Clara's courage, the weight of choosing connection over safety, I understand completely. Telling this story has left me changed in ways I'm still discovering, and I suspect Jedediah Colton's path to redemption might have stirred something in you, too. There's something about the frontier that strips away pretense and reveals who we truly are when faced with impossible choices. Jed spent 10 years building walls against pain, convinced that one tragic loss had defined him forever. But redemption isn't about erasing our wounds. It's about finding the courage to risk being wounded again for something that matters. That choice confronts us all eventually, whether to remain safely isolated or to open our doors to others, knowing that love always carries the possibility of loss. What struck me most while crafting this tale was how Jed's carefully constructed isolation nearly destroyed him, while connection ultimately saved him. We're not meant to weather life's storms alone. Clara and Annie didn't just need Jed's protection, they offered him something to believe in again. Sometimes the very people we reach out to help end up healing parts of ourselves we thought were beyond repair. The unforgiving Wyoming landscape may seem distant from our modern lives, but we all face moments that test whether we'll choose courage over comfort. The bruises we notice on someone who needs help. The child who requires protection regardless of personal cost. The family we create through choice rather than blood. Jed's frontier may be history, but the decision to open our hearts, despite past wounds, remains as relevant as tomorrow's sunrise. I found myself particularly moved by how family redefined itself throughout this story. Jed and Clara weren't bound by blood, or even romantic love at first. They were strangers, united by a common need and a moral choice. Yet in choosing to stand together, they formed something stronger than many blood relations. May wasn't their daughter by birth, but became theirs through protection, through choice, through the daily courage of showing up when it mattered. In that final scene, when the photograph of Judge Denton's family sits beside the newer image of Jed, Clara, and May, we see how healing creates its own kind of truth, one built not from perfect circumstances, but from imperfect people choosing each other day after day. The siege at the ranch teaches us something profound about our own battles, too. Sometimes we find ourselves surrounded by forces that seem overwhelming: grief, fear, doubt, or past regrets. Like Jed, watching those campfires encircle his land, we may feel there's no way out. But often the path forward isn't about escaping our circumstances, but about finding unexpected allies, discovering hidden strengths, and refusing to surrender to despair. In the end, Jedediah Colton discovered what the frontier taught those brave enough to listen. We aren't defined by our losses, but by what we build afterward. Second chances aren't simply given. They're claimed through the courage to try again, one difficult choice at a time. Clara learned that survival sometimes means waiting for the right moment to stand and fight rather than forever running. May discovered that family can be found in unlikely places, forged in the crucible of shared courage. Thank you for riding this trail with me, friend. Stories only truly live when they find hearts willing to invest in flawed characters seeking redemption. Your willingness to follow Jed from his solitary dawn to that final family photograph transforms mere words into something that matters. In a world that often celebrates isolation as strength, perhaps we can all learn something from a lonely rancher who discovered that true courage means opening the door when someone knocks, even when every instinct says to keep it barred.